A Pragmatic War. So, to begin with, what I've said a few times throughout the playthrough, this is a system that consistently I respect more than I enjoy. You can say, well, there are other games like that. This must be something complicated that, just gets you wrong in some way. It's not. It's not a complex system. I almost feel like it's designed with some elements that really get in my way of enjoying it that are hard to identify, but they're basically little frustrations that, with repeated play, would be easier to deal with. But the nature of the way I play nowadays means that I'm only really taking one look at it and not getting a chance to, play it right. And I'm not talking about in terms of tactics or whatever. I don't mind fucking up tactics. I'm talking about just getting some really basic rules right. That there aren't that many rules. That's the primary issue. There are other factors in it, like the way the rules are written, maybe the quality of the rulebook itself in terms of component, which I think a fair amount of money was spent on it, but wasted in making it too stiff and thereby able to fall apart. And we'll get to that in a bit. Where they add to the frustrations that the game provides. That's the best guess I can have, because there is nothing about this game that I should dislike, beyond the pulsed nature. But I get used to pulsed games. There are pulsed games that I really love. There are ones where I struggle more, and it's kind of hard to put my finger on it. But I think that's a frustration, that switching back and forth and whatever. But it's not a major one. In fact, there are no major frustrations here. It's just like this pile of minor ones. Anyway, let's start talking about it. Let's start with components, I guess. The first thing you get is the box is really heavy duty. Maybe not quite the GMT armored box capability, but pretty good. I don't remember earlier Compass games. The box, unless the box falls apart, I don't really think about it unless it's really, really armored. But this is pretty sturdy, like sturdier than I think they used to be. In fact, across the board, components have gotten better. A nice hard board that folds out. They're really going all out. Not just on this system either, by the way. Other games that maybe you wouldn't expect I'm thinking Prelude to Rebellion here in particular, that you wouldn't expect to be big popular sellers. Now, maybe they misestimated that heavily because it's sort of a Twilight Struggle-y type game, but it's on an obscure topic, and it's not something that I would have expected to be a heavy seller. I would not have invested in that heavy in the components the way they did. This, on the other hand, they know they've got an audience, even an audience of people who every time they play a game in this system say, that wasn't as much fun as I think it should be in my case. But the problem is I really do respect the system. I think it's historically accurate. I think it hits a lot of the things that I like about a system. For example, there's a fair amount of luck in the game. It's not too heavy. It segments the events that the players shouldn't control to a large extent from things that they should control by stripping away that CDG mechanism where you make a choice between points and event. Instead, what it does is puts you in a position where you don't have to make that choice. You don't make that choice. You might have some events that maybe you shouldn't control. That's an issue. But let's continue on with components. A couple of player aids, pretty damn good. The player aids don't have everything you'd want perhaps on them, but you know, they got to fit on a sheet of paper, and they got almost everything that you would want on them. There are a couple of places where you have to look up the rules, but that's where there's a problem. The rulebook is glossy. It takes pencil, which shocked the hell out of me, but it's made out of this kind of stiff, glossy paper that paging through it, at least roughly, created a separation on one of the staples. And it's just going to fall apart, you know. I don't remember this happening with equally hefty stock that's real paper, like say the Gamers games. It may have happened a couple of times. Those are games that, like the SPI ones, you have to kind of tear something out of the middle. So in my case, I pry the staples up and pull it out, but I'm sure a lot of people just pull it out. And in both cases, you're weakening the staples a little bit, so there's some room for a problem. But it's easy to replace a staple. What's not easy to replace is the hole in the paper that's being left in these. So there's no real answer there. Counters, there are a couple of cases where color choices, etc., were not the easiest to distinguish, say Hanover, Hesse, and the British. But for the most part, absolutely serviceable, nice quality. One thing they did that was a little strange, and tried to rectify it among other things, is they gave you a lot of blank counters, but not quite enough control counters, and not maybe enough demoralized, and there may be a couple of other marker type things that they just didn't give you quite enough of. What they did was they sent out this errata sucker, and some of it is counter replacements. Some of the counters were just wrong, and they had to, you know, have some modifications. I don't remember if there was anything too bad. I think there was one where you had to upgrade. You had to change. You would have had to change a number. Others were maybe something that was just a little funky with the coloring or something. And I think it's a really sweet move to have corrected that. They also made map patches for No Peace Without Spain's deluxe map, which apparently they managed to introduce a misprint into from the original. And for this game, a really minor one. Perhaps more, or at least as important as the counter replacements, whatever the worst of the counter replacements were giving, you know, these extra things there. I find this a really nice touch. I'm not sure that the errors in the counters and the map were enough to warrant doing this, but I'm always happy to see the hobby improving in terms of customer service. Maybe because, you know, now I'm not so poor that like buying a new game is a real hit on me. But if I'm gonna buy a game, especially if I'm gonna pay the kind of prices that games go for now, I kind of don't want to have to be writing all over the pieces and stuff. At another point, I would have said, well, you know, they're running at a low cost operation for certain situations. But anyway, I've noticed Compass's customer support is really good. I had a couple of issues recently where I had to contact customer support, and I would have to say that they're as high as anyone, you know, in terms of the quality of customer support they've been giving. You know, almost immediate replies, etc., which I kind of didn't expect. The level overall is going up, but I think Compass is up at the top at this point. Okay, the rule book itself, it's written in a fashion. Well, first of all, it is got a lot of errata in it, and maybe I didn't realize that the earlier games had a fairly large amount of errata either. I haven't gone back to look at them, but I played them earlier, and has been out for at least a year or so. So maybe some of it's just collected up errata from a large portion. But this is about 24 pages, somewhere in there. I'm gonna have to turn the fan off if I'm gonna play with the rules. Yeah, about 24 pages of rules. Call it 23 and a half because that front cover doesn't count. And it has like 4 pages of errata, which feels a little hefty, and the errata may be a little denser than the rule book. I'm not sure, probably not. So the system is largely the same system as the earlier games. It allows a little bit more maneuver, but not a whole hell of a lot. There's basically the rule with the line crossing that has been taken away. So you're able to kind of bypass some stuff that you weren't able to in the early part of the 18th century, the games that cover that. I'm not going to go too much into the rules for that particular reason. There's a lot, and maybe more than I remember in the others, although this may be just one of the burdens that the system incorporates, of special rules. Austrian succession, there's a lot of in and out of the war. Instead of modulating that all with cards, they do it with Prussia, but otherwise it's these pre-programmed, and they're kind of, a section of the rules on each one, and some of them have specific different ways that you roll a die on some of them, you don't on others. There's no real quick summary. They try to give a summary and reminder on the board, and if you don't do what I did, it should be sufficient, but I like to put my reinforcements on the turn record sheet track, and that kind of confused things. One of the things that regularly hinders me in this game, and this is core rules type stuff, is the stacking limits rules. I'm not sure why. Again, they're not that complicated. You have 3 types of stacking limitation locations. Okay, that's a little bit more complicated than, say, Britannia, which has 2. But one of the issues is there's a potential to overstack. And it's technically not voluntary, but you could set yourself up in positions where you're allowed to overstack. You don't particularly want to. But then once you overstack, specific rules come into play. It's not like, oh, well, you're wiped out, you lose the excess units or whatever. No, it's more forgiving than that, and that causes me to make more errors around this rule, in the sense that, like, it's also not immediately obvious that something is overstacked. It's a little difficult to see on the board, etc. Maybe an area-based system rather than point-to-point would have done a better job. I'm not sure. What I do find is I do often notice, gee, I'm overstacked for this. It's about the same kind of level that you'll see in a hex-based game, where different units have different stacking values, and you're fiddling around with it all the time, except that it's not at the top of your mind here, and you stumble into situations where you're like, oh shit, I should have suffered a penalty from that, or I moved units I wasn't allowed to move out of that space because they were overstacked, and crap like that. Yeah, this is where, so this powers thing is just a page and a half or so, maybe a little more than that, close to 2 pages worth of special rules that just cause me issues in terms of it. Let's look through the actual effects of the rules. It's pretty simple. Event cards. At the beginning of the game, each player draws one, but then it changes, and it's like you're drawing 1.5 a turn, which is kind of funky. You have a year where new cards go in. Again, a little bit of burden to each of these little things, and they all somehow add up to this large thing that's more likely to cause frustration for me. Each country has its own reinforcement limits that are somewhat different. So again, you're looking that up regularly to see how much can I reinforce, and it's not necessarily easy to find, for me at least, in the rule book. And it became much worse once my rule book started separating, because then I couldn't page through it rapidly. I have to start handling it like it's some kind of fragile document, which it is. I found that there's this mechanism in the series where you bid for the initiative. How hard are you going to go in the initiative on your first action? You have this random set of cards that is your hand of action points that you're allowed to do. Now, action points can be kind of reinforcements too, but it's not to the same level that they tend to be in CDGs. It's like you're allowed to upgrade one unit. Not reinforcement, but recuperation of units, or you're allowed to rally a few units in a stack or something like that. What was I going to say? Yeah. So there's this mechanism where you're bidding for who goes first. One of the problems I have with that is it kind of feels like you don't really want the initiative most of the time. There are probably a few special cases where you do. I didn't run into one. You also often want to hold your bigger points towards the end, although you can get yourself in trouble with that. But you usually don't want to. You don't have a strong reason for trying to do a lot of things right off the bat. I thought that would change more in this design, in this particular game in the system. The feeling being the other ones, kind of the less mobility means getting the jump on someone doesn't mean as much. If anything, I think actually it was more valuable in the other ones, and it still wasn't a terribly valuable advantage, if I recall correctly, which is a long-term thing. There's a certain pace and cycle to the turns. Say something meaningless, but that's kind of peculiar in this game, which is to say, because of the way the sieges work, you kind of have to move up on one card to get there on a siege, and you may have multiple things you're doing on that card, and then on further cards, in order to continue the siege, you have to play those cards. I've seen other games that work this way outside this system, or work somewhat similarly. The problem with it is that you end up in situations where you're not actually doing anything about the siege. You're not starving out the enemy or anything like that. There's no mechanism like that. And honestly, okay, I can believe that if you're not funneling supplies to the siege, you're probably not going to be able to press the bombardment, etc., as heavily as you'd want to, so you need to be able to spend a resource to do that. But it does seem like there would be some impact to a continued just blockade of a city, rather than the full-on bombardments, etc. The problem I have with that, though, is or why you can argue that sieges don't just kind of automatically handle, is during this period, and especially in the earlier period, sieges didn't tend to be ring the city and not let anyone out. They tended to be more about trying to focus your force to get that breach and build up siege works to move up on the city, which you see in things like Art of Siege of Lille or Sevastopol from the later period. There certainly was some interdiction of supply, but it wasn't 100%. So I don't know how much you want to deal with that level of things, but to some extent, it does feel like you have to expend a little too much to operate the siege, maybe. I don't know. You have to supply the troops at the siege anyway, theoretically, and to me, that kind of is a cost of the cards, anyhow. So I just don't know. So one of the fiddly little rules is the sea rules, which I didn't find a hell of a lot of use for. If you can get a jump early and invade England, you could get a win that way as the Bourbon. Otherwise, it's a lot of effort for a victory point. Unless you need to use the ocean to get across it. And using the med that way isn't terribly valuable, and using the channel that way very quickly becomes an impossibility, or at least an extremely unlikely event. Again, special limits on how much reinforcement you can put in during your reinforcement phase. You have to spend movement to convert spaces other than fortresses. This is all basic system. The interception and avoidance rules, like any point-to-point game, there's a fair amount of complexity in that, in what's generally handled in a hex game by the player maneuvering the pieces. Instead, that's abstracted here, and you've got it in area games too. So, you know, when you're looking at your first kind of war games of any given type, that's one thing. But once you start running a bunch of different types together, it becomes a little harder to remember what all the rules are surrounding these special cases. These games tend to be pretty light. This tends to be one of the heavier facets of them. And one nice thing about this is the series all use the same rules, if you can get used to the series rules. Instead of famous victories, they have major victories. Same thing otherwise. Yeah, not a lot different from the rest of the series. And again, you know, I had some hope that maybe it was, the cards are good poker quality cards. I didn't even mention them. They introduce a lot of rules into the game, though. So, I mean, I'm really trying to analyze why doesn't this work for me all that well, because it should hit on all my cylinders, as it were. It's got a fair amount of luck. I like a lot of luck in these kind of games. It's not a huge amount of luck. It's not a luck fest, but you've got a lot of places where things feel like they should go fairly. You know, there's a decent room for swinginess. For, all right, I'll do a Hail Mary. You know. Two of those are embedded in the cards, the event cards. They can significantly affect the overall flow of the play. For example, when Prussia enters and exits the war, is controlled by those event cards, and they may not even come up. Prussia may never leave the war, or they may leave and enter immediately and not leave again, or whatever. Which is kind of weird, because most of the other countries are kind of programmed in as to when they come, or they're programmed in based on a die roll, including Charles of Bavaria's death, which is got to happen and was kind of one of the more fortuitous things for the Austrians in the war. It was not exactly expected. That's something I like. Buckets of dice, I always see that as an inelegant solution, and I still see it here. This has somewhat funky rules about where casualties happen. So you're doing a buckets of dice system, but you don't cause one-to-one casualties necessarily. So if you're facing a fully functional enemy force, the best you can do is cut it in half, unless something weird is happening, like there's a space that it's retreating through that gets to shoot at them on the retreat, Or similarly, actually, you have more movement points and you pursue them and make more rolls. Um, that buckets of dice, the normal buckets of dice doesn't usually bother me too much. This little twist to it, I think, is very, very good for historical. I really like it. You don't have armies just disappearing in the battles because they get outrolled. But it may kind of screw with, again, it may be one of those little frustrations just in terms of handling it. I'm not sure. I know that there's something that's getting me, and I really think it's a piling up of all these little things that, honestly, if you got used to them all and played this a few times, you probably wouldn't be bothered by them at all, like you being me. The problem is there's usually a long gap between me playing one of these, and that's simply the number of games that I have, and that that gap just, causes me to come back to it and struggle each time that I'm playing it. Even though I actually, from an intellectual point of view, I really like the things this does in a simple fashion. And that's really all I can say, is that this is a game I should really like, and I enjoy it while I'm playing it until something comes up and frustrates me. And there are a lot of somethings that can come up and frustrate me in it. And that's kind of the trouble with it. If you're looking for something, let's say you play the game 2 or 3 times in a year, and after that you probably have it kind of internalized. It's worth getting the whole series if you're interested in the period. In that case, I think. But if you're like me and you play it once and then 5 years later you play the next one, and maybe you will never get to them again. And you have kind of this ossified brain that has trouble taking up slightly different things, it's going to be a struggle. And I feel like I kind of have lost out somewhere on something that I should be liking a lot more than I do. Up it goes, I guess. I said all this before, but we always stress my voice.